A verse-by-verse study in the book of Genesis, ESV, with Irv Risch, chapter 10. What does Genesis chapter 10 mean? Genesis 10 is sometimes called the Table of Nations. It describes the generations that followed from Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, along with the nations that came from them and the regions in which they settled after the Tower of Babel. This chapter is a slightly different take on genealogy. Rather than focusing on lineage, this passage defines the boundaries of these different tribes of people. Instead of following a narrow chain of father-son relationships deep into history, this chapter explains a broad network of cousins, following a shallow chain of brotherly relationships. The purpose is to establish the various kingdoms which will come into play later in Genesis. The first section lists the sons and descendants of Japheth. Japheth's people apparently settled mostly in the lands to the north of the region that would become the promised land of Israel. The second section details the line of Noah's son Ham. The people and nations that come from Ham will become central to Israel's story, as told in the rest of the Bible. Ham's descendants include the peoples who will eventually become Egypt, the great nation that will play a pivotal and ongoing role in Israel's history. Ham's grandson Nimrod, though Cush, will establish the powerful kingdoms of Babylon and Assyria, who will both become enemies of Israel. And the descendants of Ham's son Canaan will eventually be, mostly, driven from the promised land by the Israelites. The final section of the Table of Nations in chapter 10 describes the descendants of Shem. It is Shem's line that will lead to Abraham and the nation of Israel. The dispersal of the peoples into separate nations, languages, and tribes will happen after the events surrounding the Tower of Babel as described in Genesis 11. Chapter context: Genesis 9 described events that happened between God, Noah, and his 3 sons after the flood. Genesis 11 will tell the story of the Tower of Babel and the dispersal of the nations. Between them, Genesis 10 is a table of the nations that come from Japheth, Ham, and Shem after God divides and disperses humanity. Verse by verse. Verse 1. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood. This verse introduces what is sometimes called the Table of Nations. In addition to listing some of the descendants of Noah's sons, the chapter also mentions the lands and nations that formed among these descendants. This is the purpose God intended for mankind in his commands after the flood, to repopulate the earth, Genesis 9 verse 7. As part of his will, God had promised to never again destroy the earth with a flood, Genesis 9 verse 11. It's an awesome thought to realize that the descendants of these individuals became the peoples of the ancient world, the nations that Israel would eventually interact with as a nation themselves. The incidents of the prior chapter have a drastic impact on these future generations. Since Ham dishonored Noah, Genesis 9 verse 24, his son Canaan was cursed. The outworkings of that curse will not be clear until many generations later, when Israel arrives in the Promised Land. The verse is clear that these sons were born to Noah's 3 sons after the flood and not before. Context summary: Genesis 10 verses 1 to 5 details the descendants of Noah's son, Japheth. Japheth's sons will largely settle in the regions north of what would later become the nation of Israel. While some mention is made of these descendants, they will not be directly involved in many biblical events. Chapter 11 will describe the event that causes the peoples to be dispersed across the world into their separate regions. Verse 2. The sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The first section in chapter 10's Table of Nations follows the sons of Japheth. Japheth's descendants mostly settled to the north of where the nation of Israel would eventually reside. While the Old Testament prophets sometimes mention them, they will not feature greatly in biblical events. Thus, less is said of Japheth's successors. They were not cursed, in the way that Canaan was, Genesis 9 verse 25. Nor were they especially blessed, in the way Shem's descendants led to Abraham and the eventual Messiah, Jesus Christ, Genesis 9 verse 26. However, the names of Japheth's 7 sons can be correlated with the names and peoples of specific geographic regions in the ancient world, some of whom would intersect with the people of Israel from time to time. Some of these names would be associated with city-states mentioned later in Scripture, such as Magog, Ezekiel 38 verse 2, Tarshish, Genesis 10 verse 4, Psalm 72 verse 10, Ezekiel 38 verse 13, and Kittim, Genesis 10 verse 4, Numbers 2400 hours 24, Daniel 11 verse 30. Verse 3. The sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. Chapter 10 is sometimes called the Table of Nations. In listing the names of the descendants of Noah's sons, it is also describing the origins of the nations of the ancient world. The chapter explains the divisions of Earth's ancient tribes according to their family line. Rather than a deep line of fathers and sons, this passage shows a broad spread of brothers and cousins. The previous verse listed Japheth's 7 sons. This verse lists 3 sons of Japheth's son, Gomer. The descendants of these 3 sons became 3 tribes who settled to the north of the Promised Land. These people appear to be the Sumerians, also known as the Scythians. Verse 4. The sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. Chapter 10 lists the names of the descendants of Noah's sons. Rather than tracing a long line of fathers and sons, it shows the wide spread of Noah's descendants into various tribes. Accordingly, this passage explains the origins of the nations of the ancient world. The previous verse listed the sons of Japheth's son Gomer. This verse lists the sons of Japheth's son Javan. These 4 sons are apparently connected to the peoples who would later become the Greeks. Though Israel would not have many dealings in the Old Testament with the northern peoples who came from Japheth, these names and people do seem to be included in Bible prophecies. Some of these can be found in Ezekiel chapters 27 and 37, 39. Culturally, the Greeks would become profoundly influential and would even conquer the territories of Israel under Alexander the Great. Verse 5. From these the coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans, in their nations. All the ancient world's nations are described in this passage, according to their descent from Noah. Other genealogies in the Bible follow a chain of fathers and sons deep into history. This text is broad, showing the various tribes which came from the major descendants of Noah. The previous verses named the sons and grandsons of Japheth. From Israel's perspective, the tribes and nations that formed from these men were located, for the most part, to the far north. Most of these tribes would have little impact on Israel's history, until their descendants, the Greeks, conquered Israel's territory under Alexander the Great. It's helpful to remember that this spreading out and having separate languages came after the events surrounding the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. Until that time, all the people of the earth were concentrated in one region and spoke one language. Verse 6. The sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Chapter 10 is sometimes called the Table of Nations. In listing the names of the descendants of Noah's sons, it also describes the origins of the nations of the ancient world. The previous verses named the sons and grandsons of Japheth. This verse begins a section describing the descendants of Ham and the nations that came from them. These peoples and nations will become integral to Israel's story, and they are familiar names to this day. Ham's first generation of sons included Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Each of their lines will be described in the following verses. Egypt is also known as Mizraim, and the original Hebrew text uses the word Mishraim here. In ancient literature, the names of nations and their founders were often used interchangeably, such as with Edom and Esau, Obadiah 1 verses 8 to 10. Since the purpose of this passage is explaining the origins of the various ancient kingdoms, many English translations simply state this name as Egypt. Context summary. Genesis 10 verses 6 to 20 details the descendants of Noah's son, Ham. The majority of these tribes settled in the regions south and east of the Promised Land. While Ham's son Canaan was cursed, Genesis 9 verses 24 to 25, many of Ham's descendants established powerful nations. One of these is Mizraim, also known as Egypt. Though Canaan's sons were destined to fall to the sons of Shem, other sons of Ham would hold Israel captive for more than 400 years. This passage also contains an interesting aside about one particular man, Nimrod. Verse 7. The sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Sabteka. The sons of Rama, Sheba and Dedan. Chapter 10 is sometimes called the Table of Nations. In listing the names of the descendants of Noah's sons, it is also describing the origins of the nations of the ancient world. Earlier verses record the tribes which descended from Noah's son Japheth. Starting in verse 6, this passage begins to detail the nations which came from Ham. This verse expands on the nations which originated from Ham's son Cush. Following the events surrounding the Tower of Babel described in Genesis 11, the descendants of Noah's grandson Cush settled in Arabia and in areas of present-day Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. They include Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Sabteka, and Rama, along with Rama's sons Sheba and Dedan. Verse 8. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. The majority of this chapter is a table of nations, describing the origins of the various nations of the world. These are described according to their relationship to Noah and his sons. Verses 9 and 10 represent an interesting, unique pause in that purpose. Dropped into the middle of this table of nations is a fascinating historical aside about Nimrod, one of the sons of Cush. Initially, we're told that Nimrod was the first on earth to become a mighty man or champion, indicating that he was a powerful and renowned ruler. The Hebrew phrasing here can mean that Nimrod simply began to be mighty, or it can be interpreted to mean that he was the first person to attain that level of might. Interestingly, in many English-speaking countries, the term Nimrod is used to imply that a person is stupid, slow-witted, or incompetent. Various popular artists in the 1920s and 1930s sarcastically referred to specific hunters as Nimrod, and popular culture eventually overtook the original implications of the term. The follow verses give more detail about Nimrod's exploits and accomplishments. Verse 9. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod a mighty hunter before the Lord. The previous verse began an aside in chapter 10's Table of Nations. It introduces Nimrod, a famous, mighty man or champion. Here, Nimrod is described as a mighty hunter before the Lord. Some scholars suggest that perhaps Nimrod is associated with the kings of Mesopotamia or Assyria, who valued hunting as a greatly honored skill. It's unlikely that the phrase, before the Lord, means that Nimrod was faithful to the true God. It's more likely to mean that Nimrod was famous on the earth, where everything is before the Lord. In fact, some scholars believe that Nimrod's skill in hunting might have led him to skill in battle, and built the basis for his success. His name is similar to the Hebrew word for rebellion, and traditionally he was considered a dictator and tyrant. The nation-states founded by Nimrod, including Nineveh, Assyria, and Babel, will become some of Israel's chief enemies. Nimrod was so famous for his hunting skill that being like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord, became a common saying in the world. In the modern English-speaking world, the term Nimrod is used as an insult, mostly to someone's intelligence. This is due to a series of sarcastic references in the 1920s and 1930s, which mocked an inept hunter as Nimrod, replacing the reputation of that name with almost the exact opposite. Verse 10. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. The previous verses introduced Nimrod, famous in the world as a champion and mighty hunter. He also built a series of kingdoms for himself. Beginning in the land known as Shinar, Nimrod established his kingdom with Babel, or Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. Traditionally, Nimrod is viewed as an early tyrant, a dictator of considerable power. As the following verse will reveal, many parts of Nimrod's kingdom will eventually become powerful enemies to Israel. These include kingdoms such as Assyria and Nineveh. The city of Babel will become the focal point of the next chapter as the events around the building of the Tower of Babel unfold, Genesis 11 verses 1 to 9. Verse 11. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and. The previous verses introduced Nimrod, one of the descendants of Ham. Apparently a great ruler of the time, he is described as a mighty hunter before the Lord. Most traditions of the time also paint Nimrod as a tyrant, wielding great power in his lifetime. After establishing his kingdom in the region of Shinar in the south, Nimrod moved north into Assyria. There he built the great city of Nineveh and the close-by towns of Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and those mentioned in the following verse. Later in Scripture, Nineveh and the Assyrians will become famous for their might, cruelty, and wickedness. God will send the prophet Jonah to take a message of salvation to the people of Nineveh. Jonah will resist. The ruins of Nineveh remain to this day, near the modern city of Mosul in Iraq. Verse 12. Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, that is the great city. This verse concludes the biographical aside about Nimrod in chapter 10's Table of Nations. Nimrod, a descendant of Noah's son Ham, was a mighty man who established a kingdom of his own in the regions of Shinar and Assyria. The previous verse revealed that Nimrod established the great city of Nineveh in Assyria, along with several other cities. Rezin, mentioned in this verse, is the final of Nimrod's cities to be mentioned. The name Rezin likely meant fountainhead, and the city may have been situated on the Tigris River. In the future, Nimrod's descendants will become some of Israel's greatest enemies. They will also be directly involved in some of the Old Testament's most unfortunate incidents. Among these, as seen in the next chapter, is the incident at the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11 verses 1 to 9. Verse 13. Egypt fathered Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphtuhim. Genesis 10 presents a table of nations, describing the descendants of Noah's 3 sons, where they settled following the Tower of Babel, and what nations developed from their family lines. After an aside to describe the life of a mighty man named Nimrod who established his kingdom in Assyria, the chapter returns to the pattern with this verse. Ham's sons included Cush, Put, Canaan, and Egypt, or Mizraim. In the original Hebrew, this particular son's name is Mishraim. Some English translations use Mizraim here. The Hebrew Old Testament, however, always refers to the nation of Egypt using the word Mishraim, both in Genesis and the story of the Exodus. For this reason, many translations simply use Egypt to avoid confusion. Mizraim/Egypt's sons are listed here and in the following verse. Verse 14. Pathrusim, Casluim, from whom the Philistines came, and Caphtorim. This and the previous verse list the sons of Egypt, or Mizraim. In Old Testament Hebrew, the only word used for this person, or the nation who came after him, is Mishraim. This later became the nation of Egypt, and since that is how typical English speakers define that land today, most modern English translations stick to Egypt whenever this term arises. Egypt was one of the sons of Ham, the son of Noah. Following the Tower of Babel, the descendants of Egypt generally settled in and around the lands that make up what would become known as the great nation of Egypt. Israel's relationship with Egypt would be long and complicated. Early on, they would be kind and supportive to the people of Israel, Genesis 50 verses 1 to 14, but this would soon turn into subjection and slavery, Exodus 1 verses 1 to 14. Israel would also have a long and conflicted relationship with the Philistines, though there is some question as to whether the Philistines mentioned here are the same ones Israel fought in the time of David. Many scholars believe that this passage refers only to the Philistine people passing through an area, not necessarily originating in it. Verse 15. Canaan fathered Sidon his firstborn and hate. Genesis 10 contains a table of nations, a description of how the descendants of Noah's sons became the peoples of the ancient world. After detailing the descendants of Ham's other sons, this verse begins a listing of the sons of Canaan. These sons will become the Canaanites, the peoples who occupied the promised land before the nation of Israel arrived to claim it under the direct orders of God, Exodus 3 verse 17. The evil of these Canaanite nations would become so severe that Israel was used as God's instrument of judgment against them, Deuteronomy 9 verses 3-6. Canaan's firstborn son was Sidon. The city of Sidon, Judges 1 verse 31, Acts 27 verse 3, is one of the oldest in the region of Canaan. Canaan's son Hate has a connection to the Hittites, but apparently not a direct connection to the great nation of the Hittites that would arise later, Exodus 13 verse 5, Judges 1 verse 26. Verse 16. And the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites. This verse continues a list of the sons of Canaan, Noah's great-grandsons through his son, Ham. These sons of Canaan will become the Canaanites, the peoples occupying the promised land, which the people of Israel will come to conquer after the exodus from Egypt, Exodus 3 verse 17. Unfortunately, while other nations had their flaws, the Canaanite peoples would become especially wicked. This, more than anything else, is what motivates God to send Israel as a form of judgment, Deuteronomy 9 verses 3-6. This flows from the curse given to Canaan by Noah, on account of Ham's dishonoring of his father, Genesis 9 verses 20-25. Verse 16 mentions the Jebusites, the Amorites, and the Girgashites. The Jebusites settled in what would later become the city of Jerusalem, Judges 1 verse 21, 1 Chronicles 11 verse 4. Verse 17. The Hivites, the Arkites, the Sinites. Canaan was a son of Ham, a son of Noah. This passage lists the descendants of Canaan, most of whom would go on to become great enemies of the nation of Israel. These Canaanites go on to occupy the promised land which the people of Israel will conquer after the exodus from Egypt, Exodus 3 verse 17. In chapter 9, Noah's son Ham gravely dishonors him, resulting in Noah placing a curse on Ham's son, Canaan, Genesis 9 verses 20-25. Over time, the Canaanite people would sink further and further into evil and depravity. By the time Israel was freed from Egypt, as told in the book of Exodus, God was prepared to send judgment. This came in the form of Israel, who was allowed to conquer the land of Canaan, not because of their own merit, but in order to punish the sins of Canaan's descendants, Deuteronomy 9 verses 3-6. Verse 17 mentions the Hivites, the Arkites, and the Sinites, groups that apparently settled mostly in the north. Verse 18. The Arvadites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites. Afterward the clans of the Canaanites dispersed. This verse continues a list of the sons of Canaan, Noah's grandson. These sons of Canaan will become the Canaanites, the peoples occupying the promised land which the people of Israel will come to conquer after the exodus from Egypt. This later conquest is God's judgment on the sins of the Canaanites, Deuteronomy 9 verses 3-6, and a partial fulfillment of the curse levied against Canaan by Noah, Genesis 9 verses 20-25. Verse 18 lists the final three groups stemming from Canaan, each of which became a city-state in the north. Arvad is a small island city off the coast of Syria, also known as Ruad Island. The Zemarites lived in the city of Sumer, which may have been just south of Arvad. Hamath is in west-central Syria today, called Hama. The people of that city served Israel's kings David, 2 Samuel 8 verses 9-10, and Solomon, 2 Chronicles 8 verse 4, and the city was later retaken by Jeroboam, 2 Kings 14 verse 28. This is one of many examples of the fulfillment of Noah's curse from Genesis 9 that the descendants of Canaan would become servants to the descendants of Shem, Genesis 9 verse 26. This verse ends with the statement that the clans of the Canaanites dispersed. This may refer to the dispersal to the region of Canaan after the events of the Tower of Babel described in Genesis chapter 11. Verse 19. And the territory of the Canaanites extended from Sidon in the direction of Gerar as far as Gaza, and in the direction of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. This verse defines, in loose geographical descriptions, the approximate borders of the land occupied by the Canaanites. The description of this territory will become important later in Israel's history. God will give the region of the Canaanites to the people of Israel. It will become the promised land, Exodus 3 verse 17, and Israel will move into it, conquer its peoples, and take possession of the land and its cities. Some of the Canaanite clans listed in the previous verses will be wiped out, others will become servants to God's people Israel. This is partly due to the curse Noah levied against Canaan in Genesis 9 verses 20 to 25. It is also due to the extraordinary evil which Canaan's descendants participated in, Deuteronomy 9 verses 3 to 6. Sodom and Gomorrah will become so well known for their wickedness that their names will become shorthand for depraved evil. God's judgment on them is described in Genesis 19. Verse 20. These are the sons of Ham, by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. This verse wraps up the section describing the lines of Noah's son Ham as they dispersed and established themselves following the events described in chapter 11. Most genealogies in Genesis follow a long, history-spanning line of fathers and sons. The lists given here in chapter 10, however, are meant to be broad. Rather than tracing through time, this table of nations shows how the sons of Noah fathered all the tribes and peoples of the ancient world. Ham's sin against Noah resulted in a curse, Genesis 9 verses 20 to 25. However, Ham's descendants would become an important people group in the region. Some, in particular the Canaanites, will participate in great wickedness, and God will cause them to be conquered by his people Israel, Deuteronomy 9 verses 3 to 6. The following verses will describe how the people of Israel will come from the line of Noah's son Shem. Verse 21. To Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the elder brother of Japheth, children were born. This verse begins the final section of chapter 10's Table of Nations, describing how all of the people groups of the ancient world descended from Noah's 3 sons. This section on the line of Shem comes last, though this verse makes clear that Shem was the oldest of Noah's sons. Earlier, Ham was described using a Hebrew term meaning either youngest or least, Genesis 9 verse 24. Here, translations are split on whether Shem or Japheth is the older brother. Of course, their exact birth order is not explicitly given anywhere in the Bible. Most likely, but not assuredly, Shem was the oldest of the 3 sons Noah brought with him on the ark, Genesis 7 verse 1. Shem's line is the one that will lead to Abraham and the Israelites. Verse 21 begins by referring to Shem as the father of the Eberites. This is typical of genealogies, especially in the ancient world. The term father is often used to refer to any male ancestor, Genesis 15 verse 15, Genesis 31 verse 3. This makes Shem the father of the Eberites, in the sense that, as Eber's great-grandfather, Shem is the ancestor of that people. Through the Eberites, eventually, Shem's line will lead to Abraham, Abram. Context summary Genesis 10 verses 21 to 32 details the descendants of Noah's son, Shem. Shem's brothers, Japheth and Ham, fathered the nations described in the earlier portion of this chapter. Shem's children would be especially blessed by God. Into Shem's line, Abraham, Abram, would be born, as would the nation of Israel, and eventually the Messiah, Jesus Christ. The context given here suggests that some of these descendants were born after the events of the Tower of Babel, explained in chapter 11. Verse 22. The sons of Shem, Elam, Ashur, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. This verse lists the sons of Noah's son Shem. Shem's descendants Elam and Ashur will found significant people groups, well known historically and deeply involved in the history of Israel. Less is known about the peoples that came from Lud and Aram. Much of this same genealogical material is presented in the book of 1 Chronicles 1 verses 17 to 25. Shem's line through his son Arpachshad is the one that leads to Abraham, Abram, and Israel. This makes Shem the ancestor of figures such as King David and Jesus Christ. Verse 23. The sons of Aram, Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mash. The purpose of this passage of Scripture is to explain the origins of the ancient world's various nations and people groups. Some, such as the descendants of Ham's son Canaan, would become highly influential in the history of Israel. For that reason, the Bible devotes more details to them. Others, such as the men listed here, do not seem to have had a significant impact on the ancient world. This verse lists the sons of Shem's son Aram. Little is known from the Bible or external records about the groups that came from these men. The only noteworthy name given here is that of Uz, which is the same as the native land of Job, Job 1 verse 1, mentioned in a few places in Scripture, Jeremiah 25 verse 20, Lamentations 4 verse 21. Verse 24. Arpachshad fathered Shelah, and Shelah fathered Eber. This verse continues the genealogy of Noah's son Shem. Chapter 10 traces the origins of the ancient world's various people groups, all of whom come from the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Some of these early descendants founded great and powerful people groups. Ham's son, Mizraim, is also known as Egypt. Ham's son Canaan will father several cultures which become bitter enemies of Israel. This chapter shows the origins of city-states and nations which become well known throughout the rest of the Old Testament, such as Magog, Tarshish, Kittim, Cush, Babel, Nineveh, Sidon, and so forth. Shem's line leads through Arpachshad to Shelah to Eber and eventually to Abraham and the Israelites. This makes Shem the ancestor of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. It also fulfills the curse given by Noah, Genesis 9 verses 20 to 25, that Canaan's descendants would be subservient to those of Shem. Verse 25. To Eber were born two sons, the name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. This verse continues the genealogy of Noah's son Shem. Shem's great-grandson Eber fathered two sons. Shem's line will continue through Peleg to Abraham and the Israelites. This passage also makes an interesting comment about one of Shem's descendants, Peleg. Peleg's name apparently comes from an ancient word meaning to divide. The division of the earth in Peleg's mentioned here likely refers to the division and dispersal of humanity that will happen after the events surrounding the Tower of Babel. At that point, mankind will be dispersed over the earth, and their languages confused. Those events are described in chapter 11. This sidelong reference to Peleg is also useful for understanding ancient writing. This part of Genesis describes the descendants of Noah's sons, including their eventual geography. But chapter 11 will describe a moment when mankind is dispersed over the earth. This is due to the fact that Genesis, like many ancient records, is more concerned with themes than with chronology. In other words, the story of the Tower of Babel is not the point of this particular text, so it will be mentioned later. Scholars suggest that Eber's other son Joktan will become the father of Arab peoples. Verse 26. Joktan fathered Almadad, Shalef, Hazarmaveth, Jerah. This verse continues the genealogy of Shem, listing the sons of his great-great-grandson, Joktan. In total, 13 sons are listed. The names of several of these sons became associated with well-known areas in the larger region of the Middle East. This is part of chapter 10's Table of Nations, explaining the origin of the ancient world's various people groups. The actual dispersal of these people to their eventual geographic regions does not seem to occur until chapter 11 at the incident of the Tower of Babel. Jerah is a Hebrew word meaning new moon. Later on in history, the moon would become one of the foremost gods worshipped in the region, which seems to be the ancestral homeland of Arabic peoples. Verse 27. Hadaram, Uzal, Dikla. This verse continues the Table of Nations, describing the origins of the ancient nations. All of these tribes and people were descended from Noah, through his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Earlier passages gave details about the children of Japheth, and then Ham. Here, verse 27 continues the genealogy of Shem, through his great-great-grandson Joktan. In total, 13 sons are listed. The names of several of these sons became well-known areas in the larger region of the Middle East. The name Uzal may be Azal, an old name for Sana'a, the modern-day capital of Yemen, indicating that this branch of Joktan's line settled in that area. Verse 28. Obal, Abimael, Sheba. This verse continues listing the sons of Joktan, the great-great-grandson of Shem. In total, 13 sons are listed. The names of several of these sons became well-known areas in the larger region of the Middle East. As such, Joktan would be considered the father of the Arabic people. This particular part of Genesis is only concerned with explaining the family relationships involved. Exactly how and when these descendants arrived in their territories is not explained here. Later, Chapter 11 will explain the incident of the Tower of Babel, where these various people and tribes are dispersed across the earth. Verse 29. Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab, all these were the sons of Joktan. Joktan was a great-great-grandson of Shem, one of Noah's 3 sons. In this chapter, sometimes called the Table of Nations, Scripture explains the origins of the various kingdoms and people groups of the ancient Middle East. Joktan is credited here with 13 sons. Several of these names will become well-known within the region surrounding Israel. In fact, Joktan seems to be the father of the Arabic people, as his sons are the primary inhabitants of those lands. The regions of Ophir and Havilah were famous in the ancient world for their gold, Genesis 2 verse 11. Verse 30. The territory in which they lived extended from Mesha in the direction of Sephar to the hill country of the east. The previous few verses listed the 13 sons of Joktan, the son of Eber. The names of several of these sons became well known as specific regions or people groups in the Middle East. This verse describes the geographical territory occupied by the various groups of people descended from Joktan. Scholars are uncertain of exactly what modern-day areas these names represent. However, the information given in the broader passage indicates that Joktan was the father of the Arabic people. This portion of Scripture is devoted to explaining how Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, became the ancestors of all of the world's nations. Some of the names listed here will become associated with famous, or infamous, cities or regions of the Bible. An explanation for how they found themselves living in different locations and speaking different languages will come in chapter 11. Those details are part of the story of the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11 verses 1 to 9. Verse 31. These are the sons of Shem, by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. This verse serves to formally conclude the genealogy of Shem and his descendants, along with describing the regions in which they settled. However, the line from Shem to Abraham will be described more specifically in chapter 11. This entire chapter has been devoted to explaining the origins of the Middle East's various nations. All people, including every possible tribe or race, are descended from Noah and his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Notably, the details in this part of the Bible are only concerned with family relationships. Other than a quick comment about Peleg, Genesis 10 verse 25, the story of how the different tribes wound up with separated languages and territories is left entirely to the next part of Scripture. That explanation will come through the story of the Tower of Babel. Verse 32. These are the clans of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies, in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. This verse serves as a formal conclusion to chapter 10's Table of Nations. It has finished its work of presenting the genealogy of Noah through his 3 sons and their sons and describing the peoples and nations that came from them, along with the regions in which they settled following the Tower of Babel. Rather than focusing on a single, deep line of fathers and sons, this list has emphasized the broad connection between all people. Instead of delving into the details of how they came to be separate people, with separate nations and languages, this passage simply explains how these men were related to each other. The story of the Tower of Babel and the dispersal of humanity will be told in chapter 11, starting in the very next verse. End of chapter 10. Please note: the material use in this video is from BibleRef.com, which is from Got Questions Ministries and is posted here to be read by immersive reader in the Edge browser. If you copy this material, please follow these rules. Content from BibleRef.com may not be used for any commercial purposes, or as part of any commercial work, without explicit prior written consent from Got Questions Ministries. Any use of our material should be properly credited. Please make it clear the content is from BibleRef.com. BibleRef.com content may not be altered, modified, or otherwise changed unless such changes are specifically noted.